He leaned on the counter like he owned the planet, wore a gold watch, pinky ring, breath that smelled like menthols and power. "A raise?" he said, like the word was foreign. My mom stood in front of him in her apron, flour on her cheek, hands shaking just slightly. She was 37, 2 kids, 3 jobs, more hours than sleep. "Yes," she said. "I've been here 5 years. Never late. I train the new girls. I run the morning shift. I haven't gotten a raise in 3." He scoffed, laughed. "Linda, you get paid what I can afford. You don't like it. You know where the door is." I was 12, sitting in the back booth of the diner with my math book open, eating cold fries. I watched my mom stare him down, jaw tight, eyes wide like glass. But she didn't cry. Not then. She just turned, walked back into the kitchen, and kept working. That night she sat on the floor folding laundry at 2 a.m. My little brother was asleep next to her. I brought her tea. She took it without looking up. I said, "Why didn't you quit?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Because quitting doesn't feed you." That stuck with me harder than any bedtime story ever could. Her name was Linda May Carter, and she was everything: cook, cleaner, driver, tutor, bodyguard, nurse, mother. And still the world called her unskilled. She worked harder than anyone I knew, stood 10 hours a day, smiled through back pain, took double shifts, got her hours cut when she asked questions, got her name misspelled on every schedule, and every month the landlord still raised the rent. The grocery bill still grew, the electricity still flickered when it rained. But my mom never asked for pity. She asked for fairness. And the world told her, no. That's where it started. With that man behind the counter. With that laugh. With that shift where she got paid $8.20 an hour, while the manager took phone calls from his beach condo. That was the day I decided I was going to change something. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know what. But I knew this much. I would never let someone laugh in my mother's face again. I studied like it was survival, took honors everything, ran from home to school to part-time jobs and back. I skipped dances, I skipped parties. I didn't care about prom. I cared about power, about paperwork, about finding the exact words that held people down so I could learn how to break them. When I was 16, I found my mom at the table one night crying into a W-2. She had worked 52 hours that week. After taxes and deductions, her check said $318.27. She said, "How am I supposed to make that stretch?" I didn't have an answer, but I wrote it down. Years later, I got into law school. I was the only person in my class whose mom worked in a kitchen, the only one who knew how it felt to buy bread with change from the car floor. I didn't speak much in class, just listened, watched, took notes. I didn't want to win debates. I wanted to rewrite rules. And the more I read, the angrier I got. There were laws to protect landlords, corporations, patents, logos. But not people like my mother. No federal law guaranteeing a living wage. No penalties for wage suppression under at-will employment. No accountability for bosses who cut hours to avoid healthcare coverage. No framework to punish subjective performance reviews that targeted women, especially older women, especially moms, especially single ones. So I started collecting stories. I launched a side project, a blog called What She's Worth. Anonymous submissions, stories from working women. I got hundreds, then thousands, cooks, cleaners, caregivers. Women who were told, "Smile more," instead of "Good job." Women who trained men that later became their bosses. Women who got fired for taking their legally allotted breaks. Women who were paid less because he has a family to support while they were supporting 3. I compiled them, coded them, turned them into data, and found patterns. The problem wasn't bad bosses. The problem was a system that let them be bad and rewarded them for it. I brought the data to a professor. She introduced me to a labor attorney. He introduced me to a labor organizer. That led to state reps. That led to a bill. We called it the Fair Compensation Equity Act. It was bold. It had teeth. It required that employers with more than 25 employees conduct anonymous, independent pay audits every 2 years, with penalties for discrepancies. It created a path for employees to report wage suppression without retaliation. It required salary transparency for posted roles, and it recognized caregiving status, not marital, as a protected employment category. People said we were dreaming. I said we're not dreaming, we're documenting. The day we introduced the bill, the room was half empty. 3 state reps, 2 interns, 1 reporter. The mic was old, the air smelled like burnt coffee, but I stood there in my thrift store blazer and read every word of the proposal like it was a war declaration. Because it was. I said, "This law doesn't ask for charity. It demands truth. It makes invisible labor visible. It makes silence illegal." They nodded politely. One man said, "Sounds expensive." Another said, "Isn't this anti-business?" I smiled and said, "Not if your business model depends on exploitation." We didn't have lobbyists. We had lunch breaks. We didn't have PACs. We had mothers with receipts. I printed 400 pages of testimonies and delivered them to every office in the building. I wrote op-eds. I cold called. I stood in parking lots handing flyers to anyone who would listen. They ignored me at first. Then they started getting nervous. A conservative think tank published a blog post calling me dangerous, said I was trying to destroy the free market. Someone dug into my background and posted screenshots of my mother's bankruptcy filing online. One email said, "Maybe if she worked harder, she wouldn't need her daughter begging for laws." I didn't respond. I just kept working. One day, I got home and found my mom on the floor. She'd passed out from exhaustion, low blood sugar. Her manager made her skip lunch because the shift was short. I sat next to her on the kitchen tile and held her hand. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Baby, maybe the world just doesn't change." I said, "Maybe it just needs new people to change it." I brought her story to the Capitol. I showed her W-2. I showed the paycheck stub. I showed a spreadsheet comparing the wages of male versus female staff at her workplace. The gap was 23%. I told them, "This isn't about feelings. This is math." The hearings started. Opponents came armed with buzzwords: job creators, burden on small business, overreach. But I came with numbers, with testimonies, with women who'd never spoken into a mic before, now standing with trembling voices saying, "I worked 20 years and never got promoted. Not once. I trained every man who did." That's when things started to shift. A young rep, Latina, first term, former waitress, stood and said, "I've waited tables. I've been that woman. Let's do this." The vote passed committee, by one. But then came the real battle. Big restaurant lobbyists stepped in, hospitality coalitions, business associations. A man in a suit once cornered me in the parking garage and said, "You're about to cost us millions." I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You've already stolen billions." They launched a campaign, TV ads, radio hits. "Don't let radicals destroy small businesses." My face showed up on a billboard with the words, "She wants to tell you what to pay your workers." I laughed when I saw it, because yeah, I did. Then my mom got fired. The manager said they were downsizing, but they kept 3 new hires. One of them didn't speak English. 2 of them were his nephews. She packed her locker in silence, didn't even fight it. She came home, sat at the table, and said, "I feel like a used napkin." I hugged her and said, "They don't get to throw you out, we're throwing them out." I went back to the Capitol, held a press conference, held up my mom's apron. "This is what the economy runs on, and the system calls it disposable." That video hit 1 million views in 3 days. The second hearing was packed. News cameras, protesters, supporters, opponents. My inbox flooded with threats and with stories. A woman in Kansas wrote, "I got fired after my 3rd miscarriage. My boss said, 'You're too emotional.'" Another from Florida wrote, "My boss gave the man I trained a raise, told me, 'Men need more.'" I printed them all. Everyone, brought them in a box, dumped them on the Senate floor. "This is what you're voting on," I said. "Not theory, not policy, people." The vote failed by 2. 2. After all the hours, after all the meetings, after the stories, the interviews, the pressure. 2 hands in the air that meant no. One of them belonged to a senator who promised me she was on the fence. The other belonged to a man who didn't even look me in the eyes. He stared at his phone the whole time. When the final gavel dropped, my heart sank like a stone. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. I walked out of the chamber and straight into the hallway. My mom was there, holding a sign that said, "Pay us fairly." She saw my face and knew. I couldn't speak. She didn't hug me. She just took my hand. Said, "Back to work?" I nodded. Back to work. We regrouped, reformulated. The internet had our back. We didn't have donors, but we had fire. Hashtags, interviews, podcasts, TikToks. I gave a talk on a YouTube channel with 2 million subscribers. We got mentioned on NPR, then CNN, then someone from DC called. "Have you considered taking this federal?" I laughed. "I can't even afford a train ticket." He said, "We'll fly you out." I met with 2 congressional staffers in a Starbucks near Capitol Hill. They'd read the bill, said it was legally ambitious but structurally sound. One of them, a young black woman from Baltimore, said, "I read every word of your blog. You turned data into dignity." She asked if I wanted to testify before the House Labor Committee. I flew home that night, crying silently in seat 14C. My mom met me at the airport, said, "You're going national now?" I said, "We are." The Capitol felt bigger than I imagined, the ceiling taller, the echo louder. But I stood there in my Target blazer and told Congress the same thing I'd told my state. This is not about punishing business. It's about ending legalized exploitation. It's about my mom, and every woman like her, who carried this country on minimum wage while Wall Street cashed bonuses. Some nodded. One man rolled his eyes. I kept going. I read stories aloud. I said names. I held up photos. Then I said, "If we can't afford to pay fairly, then we can't afford to pretend this economy works." 2 weeks later, a congresswoman from Illinois introduced the Equal Compensation Accountability Act, built on the foundation of our state bill. It wasn't perfect, it had compromises, but it had teeth. A coalition formed. Unions, civic groups, even some small business leaders who said, "We do this already. It's not impossible. It's just uncomfortable." The opposition came fast. News anchors called me a socialist in disguise. Commentators said, "This girl wants government in your wallet." I said, "I want justice in your payroll." Then my mom got sick. Stage 2, ovarian. She tried to hide it, said she didn't want to distract me, but I canceled every event, every call, sat with her through chemo, read her poems from her favorite Maya Angelou collection. She said, "You're doing it, Sky. You're fixing what they broke in me." I said, "We're doing it together." Then the bill passed committee. By one vote, one. The vote was scheduled for a Tuesday. I barely slept the night before. My mom was too weak to travel, but she made me promise I'd call her the second it was over. I wore her favorite color, deep burgundy, and the same gold pin she gave me on my law school graduation day. I sat in the gallery, clutching the railing like it was the edge of a cliff. Roll call began. Yes, yes, no, no, yes. My heart pounded louder than the chamber. Then 218, the tipping point, final count 221 for 214 against. It passed. The Equal Compensation Accountability Act was now law. Reporters swarmed, people hugged me, staffers cried. I walked outside into the cold DC sunlight and called my mom. I couldn't speak for a minute, just stood there. Finally I said, "We did it," she whispered. "I knew you would." Then she said something I'll never forget. "Now they can't laugh at us anymore." The law changed everything. Companies over 50 employees were now required to post salary ranges. Anonymous audits became mandatory every 2 years. Discrimination complaints went into a national database. Caregiver status became a protected class. Within the first year, over 3,000 women received back pay settlements. Within 2, wage gaps in audited companies dropped 18%. But the real change? It wasn't on paper. It was in the way women looked at themselves. Not invisible, not disposable, but undeniable. A year later, I was asked to give the keynote at a national women's labor conference. The room was packed: lawyers, waitresses, activists, engineers, janitors. I stood on stage and said, "My mom was told she didn't deserve a raise, but she deserved the world. And when they told her no, I wrote yes. And now that yes belongs to all of you." Standing ovation, tears, but not mine. I was done crying. Now I was building. My mom passed 6 months later, peacefully, holding my hand. Her last words were, "You rewrote it all." And I did. But not for revenge, for women like her. For the girl bussing tables at 16. For the mother picking up an extra shift while her baby sleeps. For the woman told, "You're lucky to have a job." For every Linda Carter in this country, who never got credit but still showed up. They told my mom she didn't deserve a raise, so I changed the law, and I'm just getting started. Thank you for watching. If you want to get more that kind of stories, press like and check out our channel.